In 1997, two men sat down and wrote out a list of the ways America's next crisis might begin. A foreign terrorist group with a nuclear threat, a financial system scraped off the floor, and a new contagious virus, no vaccine, forced quarantines, the National Guard in the streets. They were not describing the past. They were describing a decade that had not happened yet, and they attached years to it. One of them did not live to see any of it come true. The other is still here, and he has moved the dates. The book is called The Fourth Turning, an American prophecy, and on one page, the authors run the clock forward like a train schedule. Quote, "If the crisis catalyst comes on schedule around the year 2005, then the climax will be due around 2020, the resolution around 2026. Read that again. In 1997, they named 2020 as the year America's crisis would peak. They named 2026 as the year it ends. And a few pages earlier, sometime before the year 2025, America will pass through a great gate in history. Drop the robes, the candles, the crystal ball. William Strauss was a Harvard-trained lawyer who had worked for the U.S. Senate and, on the side, founded a satirical comedy troupe. Neil Howe was an economist and historian who spent his career buried in demographics and entitlement policy. Their instrument wasn't a vision, it was a spreadsheet of American birth years. They weren't reading the stars, they were reading census tables, war records, and the diaries of people who had already lived through the thing they said was coming back around. And what they said was, coming back is winter. Their term for it, a fourth turning, not a rough patch, a crisis that rebuilds the country down to the studs. Their line was blunt. A fourth turning does not require economic depression or civil war, but it does require public sacrifice and political upheaval. And they put it in the same weight class as the American Revolution, the Civil War, and the twin emergencies of the Great Depression and World War II. That's the company they were keeping. Not a bad decade, a gate. You come out the other side a different country. So why does the arithmetic keep landing on this year? Do the math they did. Their last American crisis ends in 1946 War I, new order built, the country remade. Add roughly 80 years, the length of one long human life, and you land right here in the middle of this decade. Then there's the coincidence they never planned for. America turned 250 years old 10 days ago, the semi-quincentennial, the country's biggest birthday in a century, sitting directly on top of the year their book circled. Here's the machine underneath it. History, Strauss and Howe argued, doesn't move in a straight line, it moves in seasons. They borrowed an old Roman word for the length of one long human life, the saculum, roughly 80 to 90 years. And they cut that life into 4 seasons, each running about 20 years. Spring, summer, fall, winter, except they gave them different names. The high, the awakening, the unraveling, and the crisis. The high is the season right after a crisis. Strong institutions, boring conformity, everyone rowing in the same direction America in the 1950s. The awakening is when the kids raised inside all that safety get bored and burn the rule book. That's the 60s. The unraveling is when institutions lose their grip and the country splinters into camps that agree on nothing, the culture wars of the 80s and 90s. Then comes winter. The crisis. Institutions get torn down and rebuilt, and the question of what kind of country this actually is finally gets answered. But what actually turns the wheel? People. Each season raises a different kind of child, and those children grow up and cause the next season. The generation coddled through a crisis grows up entitled and starts an awakening. The generation raised in that chaos grows up cynical, self-reliant, allergic to institutions. And the generation raised as protected children, the ones handed helmets and permission slips, grows up into exactly the civic-minded soldiers a crisis needs. 4 seasons, 4 generational types. Each one manufactures the next. That's the entire engine. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Line up American history, and it does keep rhyming. The American Revolution, their dates, 1773 to 1794, The Civil War 1860 to 1865, the Great Depression and World War II 1929 to 1946. Then the post-war high, the 60s awakening, the long unraveling that ran from Reagan to Clinton. Each crisis roughly one lifetime apart from the last. And every single time, the crisis was run not by prophets, but by whoever happened to be middle-aged and in charge when the bill came due. The pattern is not clean, and to their credit, they said so themselves. The Civil War arrived early and ended fast. It broke the rhythm. Their explanation was grim. That crisis was so brutal it burned a whole generation out of the cycle before it ever got its turn. So this isn't a Swiss watch. It's a heartbeat. It drifts. But here's where it gets genuinely strange, because in 1997 they didn't just describe the season that was coming. They described the weather. They sketched what the spark might look like. Not vague poetry, actual scenarios. 1. A foreign terrorist group strikes, claiming to hold a nuclear weapon, and America goes to war and starts searching its own citizens. 2. A new contagious virus, no vaccine, forced quarantines, the National Guard deployed. 3. Conflict with Russia, American diplomats seized, and open talk of bringing back the draft. That was, on paper, in 1997, before 9/11, before COVID, before Ukraine. Sit with that for a second. They said the catalyst would arrive around 2005. It arrived in 2008, the year Lehman Brothers collapsed and the American financial system had to be propped up with public money to keep it standing. 3 years late, but Neil Howe has said flatly that this was the one, not 9/11. 9/11 produced fear and flags, and within a few years the country went back to shopping. It reset nothing. The 2008 crash did. Trust in banks, trust in Washington, trust in the plain idea that your kids will do better than you, that's what never came back. And 2020, the exact year they circled as the climax, a virus jumped species, the plane stopped flying, and the largest economy on Earth was switched off by executive order, not the year before. Not the year after. The one they printed 23 years ahead of time. You can call that a coincidence. Plenty of serious people do, and I'll get to them. But it's a coincidence with a date stamp on it, and the date stamp says 1997. Take the theory's description of winter, then look out the window. Institutions nobody trusts. A Congress that governs by shutdown threat. Political violence that has stopped being shocking. A federal debt curve everyone agrees is unsustainable and nobody will touch. Two halves of one country that no longer share a set of facts, let alone a set of solutions. The theory called that mood almost 30 years before it showed up. And it didn't call it from the headlines, it called it from birth certificates. Which is why this stopped being just a book. Al Gore called their earlier work the most stimulating thing he had ever read on American history and sent copies to members of Congress. Then, in 2009, a filmmaker named Steve Bannon sat Neil Howe down in front of a camera for a documentary called Generation Zero, a film built entirely on this theory. Bannon's read was simple. The catalyst already happened in 2008. Years later, that same man was standing in the West Wing as chief strategist to the President of the United States. There's a detail from inside that filming that should stop you cold. Bannon also interviewed the historian David Kaiser, who later wrote about it publicly. Bannon kept circling one point: every previous crisis came with a great war, and each war was bigger than the last. Revolution, Civil War, World War II. So he pressed him repeatedly to say on camera that a conflict at least the size of the Second World War was coming. Kaiser refused, he wouldn't say it. And what unsettled him wasn't the question. It was that Bannon didn't seem troubled by the answer. Here's the crack in all of it. Academics despise this theory, not mildly viscerally. The writer Michael Lind called it pseudoscience and said most of its predictions about the American future turn out to be, quote, as vague as those of fortune cookies. A New York Times reporter summed up the professional consensus even more brutally. Many academic historians dismiss the book as about as scientific as astrology. And the charge is fair on its face. Give me 4 seasons, 80-year cycles, and enough slack in the dates, and I can make any decade fit. And honestly, they're not entirely wrong. The theory cannot tell you what happens next Tuesday. It can't name the war, the crash, or the man. All it claims is that a mood arrives on a schedule set by how long people live and how quickly a country forgets. That's it. But the critics still have one thing to explain away: the 2005 spark, the 2020 climax. And that page of scenarios, sitting there in black and white long before anyone had a reason to write it, none of that was read backward into history. It was printed in advance in 1997. Fortune cookies don't usually come with footnotes. So, what does the surviving author say now? William Strauss died in 2007, 1 year before the crash he had spent his life describing, which left Neil Howe alone with the prophecy and alone with the calendar. In 2023, he published the sequel, The Fourth Turning is Here. Everyone expected a victory lap. 16 years of headlines had done his arguing for him. Instead, he did something almost nobody talks about. He didn't retract a single word of the theory. He moved the date. In the new math, the crisis didn't start in 2005. It started in 2008 with the crash, and that pushes the whole schedule back. The climax, the hard part, the stretch a country does not walk away from unchanged, now lands in the early 2030s. His words, sometime before the mid-2030s, America will pass through the Great Gate. So 2026 is no longer the finish line. Under Howe's own revision, this year is not the end of winter. It's the middle of it. The storm you thought you were surviving hasn't arrived yet. That's the move I promised you at the top. He didn't cancel the prophecy, he pushed it out. And here's the strangest part. He insists what's on the far side of that gate is a boom, not a ruin. Neil Howe has said he's genuinely bullish on America in the 2030s, a new high, a rebuilt country. It's the space between here and there that he won't describe in detail because nobody can. This November, this country votes in a midterm in the exact year a book from 1997 circled on a calendar. Watch what the losing side does. Every fourth turning in their model shares one tell: it never announces itself. It only looks obvious afterward when somebody finds the page where it was already written. Got an angle I missed? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe if you want me to keep digging into this stuff.